Hello, very beautiful community. There is a video that's often requested, and it's about the collapse of Russia's World War II myth. And we might do it on the main channel at some point, but meanwhile, Merry Christmas, and lovely to have you with me. I hope you're having a special time around the holidays. If you're really struggling, I'm sending you my extra love. But let's talk about this collapse of Russia's Second World War myth together. And if I struggle a little bit as I speak, it's because I'm temporarily vertical. I'm here in the countryside, which is lovely because I couldn't travel by car for quite a bit. So to get here is marvelous. And we'll give this discussion a go. So tuck yourselves in, probably be 10-15 minutes. We can start. So the first thing to understand about Russia's Second World War myth is that it's gone through two layers of propagandistic deformation. Now, you remember how we talk about the difference between Soviet and Russian propaganda when we heat that cabbage for us. But what happened to the Second World War myth is that midway through the war, it began to be shaped via the prism of the unlovely polish of Stalinist propaganda. So the first layer that this myth has is alternate reality Soviet propaganda. But over and above that layer, it's now this kind of strange sandwich where there is also post-truth Putinist propaganda on top of it, which doesn't say here's an alternate reality you've got to believe in. It says anything can be anything it's said to be by anyone. So you've got to understand that you've got this sort of double toxic sandwich of incompatible propaganda modes constructing and corrupting the Russia's Second World War myth. I think the second thing to understand is that you've got to appreciate the three predicaments of being stuck in an unconstructive cultural myth. One is you can keep getting yourself stuck in it. Two, you can come out of it and let the myth go. That's never a matter of decision, right? Cultural transformation is never a matter of decision. It's a matter of moments of moment coming and going, and a certain myth dissolving as a result. But the third thing to do is you can go forward in the myth. That's to say, keep the story while trying to repair it from inside like a boat out at sea. And I'm talking about this for my and your benefit, right? We're not giving advice to Russians here because we ourselves have cultural myths that we can learn about improving and fixing by reflecting on other countries' more disastrous myths than our own. So we're talking for us here. But nevertheless, I cannot possibly see how Russia lets that myth go. Either it'll get stuck in it until enough history passes, or there can be a certain kind of historicizing, maybe even decolonizing reconstruction of it that's much more in touch with reality and much more constructive to fruitful politics. Now, arguably the single most disturbing feature of the Soviet World War II myth, which has persisted through its Russian manifestation too, right? Post-truth propaganda hasn't eliminated that element of the myth. And that's the centrality of sacrifice in it. Sacrifice for Stalin, sacrifice for the regime, sacrifice for the motherland embodied in the incarnation of a single individual regime. Taken to such an extent that it becomes a certain kind of cult of death, whereby the dying is somehow the point. That's to say, it's not just a means to an end, it's an end in itself. And what does that reverberate off fascism. Right? Violence and death is an end in itself. So there is a fascist element to Russia's anti-fascist World War II myth. That's the first thing I think I want to put on the table. And the second thing I want to put on the table is that it's gone through a second deformation of post-truth Putinite propaganda, while also being washed in Putin's ideology. That isn't a post-truth ideology in the sense that it's just empty. It's not empty. It consists of a kind of hyper-neoliberalism whereby all conflict is normal, and if you're the stronger party, you'll win. It's got a mystical element whereby you're elevating Russia from the back row of nations to the front row of nations in a single swoop. It's got a fascist element around the equation of the leader with the nation. Even though Putin doesn't quite have a cult of personality in Russia, he's certainly the only institution, political institution with perceived legitimacy. The population certainly isn't fascistized in Russia, except for a very small minority. But the education system is being infused with ideas of violence as an end in itself, war as an end in itself. And there is certainly a project of a kind of revolutionary return to a past that never was in Putin's project. And so all of these elements have now got mixed in, these Putinite elements, together with the Putinite post-truth approach. And even when Russians today, sometimes, most Russians don't say that, but when a minority of Russians say we can repeat it, можем повторить, right? We can do it again, march on Berlin. It's not quite of the same quality, right, as what you had in the 40s. And there's a kind of a neoliberal element to it. It's a kind of we can repeat it because ultimately nobody who isn't us exists. So nobody except us exists, and that's how we'll get there. That's how we'll do it. Nothing that's not us is real. Nothing that doesn't touch with our interest is real. So there's very much a new flavor to this line, a Putinite flavor to this line. We can repeat it. Obviously, there's a minor problem here for the Russians that they didn't begin the war as a war of self-defense, right, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And there is also the point that victory was a victory of the Soviet people, the peoples that constituted the Soviet people and the Allies. It wasn't a Russian victory. There's quite a bit of equation of Russia with all the peoples who actually participated going on. Then there's this very important point that's important to judge historically, that the nations the Soviets saved, they didn't liberate. The case that Russia liberated the Baltics is very weak. They occupied the Baltics. But the case that they rescued the Baltics, that they saved the Baltics, is very strong, because it was in Nazi plans to exterminate, over 80% of the Estonian population, half of the populations of Latvia and Lithuania. So you're looking at a kind of a choice between a lesser evil and a greater evil as far as occupations go. So the liberatory dimension must be questioned here, as indeed must the entire credentials of the regime. So what do the Russians need to do here? Well, the first thing they need to do is they need to historicize the story, right? They need to make the war more about the war as it was, rather than as it is concocted to have gone, and to make the war more about war rather than about victory. So we're talking about the reintroduction not just of the crimes and atrocities of the Soviet army, but of the poverty and squalor and calamity of the Soviet experience of the war. Truthfulness, rather than all the kind of magical thinking that during the war already began to emerge about the siege of Leningrad, for instance. On top of historicizing it, the second thing they need to do is detach the leader and the regime from the people. It was a victory of peoples, but not a victory of the regime. In fact, the Soviet Union was one of the victors of the war in spite of Stalin, not because of Stalin. The third thing they need to do is decolonize the myth. And that's not to say that you've got to jump around on the internet and do fancy slogans about making Russia small again, which is itself a form of soft fascization, because you can't deal in the self-determination of other peoples unless you ask them what they themselves feel about it. But decolonization means tying the Second World War, tying the improvement of the Second World War myth with the most central question Russia will face after Putin is gone, which is what holds all of these people together? If you're Russian, if you're a Russian citizen, what holds all of us here together, right? They'll need to ask that about themselves. And you can begin quite easily tying that to the Second World War, right? Because these are all peoples who are descendants, right, of those who partook in the war. And there is a possibility for many different kinds of stories to emerge. And you can absolutely link that to a constructive project of decolonization. Fundamentally, decolonization is not a result, it's a dialogue that may lead to one kind of a result or another. It's a constructive political dialogue. The fourth thing that Russians are going to need to do is begin to listen and read and see movies, novels, operas, plays, songs differently. It doesn't mean that you've got to throw them out of the window, but it means that you've got to recognize that if you take a song like Victory Day, not originally, but most famously sung by Joseph Kobzon, who died about 6 years ago by the end of his life. I'll link the song below if you are curious. Who by the end of his life was, a kind of Kremlin actor, fell out with his Ukrainian friends after 2014. And the song is from 1975. It's not from the war, but it's probably the single biggest form of cultural entertainment, example of cultural entertainment that expresses this myth. What do you do about it, right? And my suggestion is you can't listen to it in the same way. You have to listen to it with a bit of a filter, but it doesn't mean you stop listening to it if you're Russian, because you can't come out of that myth. You're either going to be stuck in it, you're going to constructively reformulate it. Schiller's famous distinction between the naive and the sentimental artist is fundamentally a distinction about an unself-conscious, organic, immediate relationship with something and a more self-aware, self-reflective, self-conscious relationship with it. And what I'm going to say now is that, many, many decades into the BS of Russia's World War II myth, you cannot listen naively to these songs if you're Russian. You're bullshitting yourself if you're listening to them naively. You yourself know you can't fully listen to them naively if you're Russian. Something feels wrong, but you're inclined to maybe overlook it. So you begin to listen to them with a filter, more ironically, perhaps, in a more self-conscious and self-aware way. And that's important too. And a conversation about how you begin to view, listen, and read differently is important too for them. Health's been tough during this chat, so that's why it's so rambly. But I hope it's been a little bit rich. Happy Christmas, and talk to you very soon, beautiful community.